Black judges command silences arresting officers reveals true authority. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Marcus Washington entered. The seasoned jurist's imposing 6'3" frame commanded attention without effort, his salt-and-pepper beard and penetrating gaze reflecting 20 years on the bench. But today was different. Today, the defendants seated at the table weren't the usual suspects. They were officers Brian Calloway and Derek Simmons, the same officers who had arrested Judge Washington's son just 3 days earlier. As Judge Washington took his seat, he noticed Officer Calloway's subtle smirk, a fleeting expression of superiority that vanished when their eyes met. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Everyone knew the connection. Everyone wondered the same thing: would justice be served or would vengeance prevail? "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Washington," announced the bailiff, his voice echoing through courtroom 317 of the Essex County Courthouse. Judge Washington adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room. His son wasn't present. Marcus Jr. was still recovering from what the hospital report had called injuries sustained during apprehension. What the clinical language failed to capture were the bruises on his son's face, the cracked rib, and the haunted look in his eyes when he described how the officers had mistaken him for a robbery suspect and refused to listen to his explanations. "Be seated," Judge Washington said, his deep voice betraying none of the turmoil within. He had a decision to make that would test everything he believed about justice, authority, and the system he had served for 2 decades. The case before him was seemingly unrelated, a procedural hearing on evidence collection in a drug trafficking case. But these officers were the arresting parties. He could recuse himself. Perhaps he should, or he could use this moment to demonstrate what true authority actually meant. The weight of his gavel felt unusually heavy in his hand. 3 months earlier, Judge Marcus Washington had celebrated his 55th birthday with a small gathering at his Tudor-style home in the historically black neighborhood of Glenwood. His wife Evelyn, a pediatric surgeon, had insisted on hosting despite her grueling schedule. Their son Marcus Jr., now 24 and in his 2nd year of law school, had flown in from Michigan for the weekend. "To the most principled man I know," Evelyn had toasted, raising her glass of Pinot Noir. "The man who taught me that authority isn't about power but responsibility." Their guests, mostly colleagues from the courthouse and Evelyn's hospital, had applauded warmly. Marcus had smiled, embarrassed by the attention but grateful for the life they'd built. After growing up in public housing on the south side of the city, he never took their comfortable existence for granted. Later that evening, as they cleared dishes together in the kitchen, Marcus Jr. had asked the question that would linger in Judge Washington's mind for months to come. "Dad, do you ever feel like the system you serve isn't serving everyone equally?" The judge had paused, a wine glass suspended mid-dry in his hands. "Every day," he'd admitted, "but that's precisely why I remain in it." "But what good is authority if it doesn't create change?" his son had pressed. Now, as Judge Washington stared at the 2 officers who had brutalized his son, that question echoed in his mind. What good indeed? Officer Calloway stood accused of tampering with evidence in multiple cases over the years, but departmental investigations had cleared him each time. Officer Simmons had 3 excessive force complaints in his file, all dismissed. Their precinct had the highest number of civilian complaints in the district, yet the lowest rate of officer discipline. They represented everything that made the public distrust law enforcement. They were also the same officers who had approached his son outside a convenience store, demanded identification, and then, when Marcus Jr. reached for his wallet, claimed he was making a threatening movement. What followed was recorded on store security cameras, a takedown so violent that Marcus Jr.'s glasses shattered against the pavement, followed by handcuffing so rough it left marks on his wrists for days. Charges were dropped within hours once Marcus Jr.'s identity was confirmed with a mumbled apology from the precinct captain. No formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no consequences for the officers. And now here they were, standing in his courtroom, their futures partially in his hands. Defense attorney Leonard Brooks approached the bench. "Your Honor, given the recent events involving your son, we respectfully request that you recuse yourself from this case." The prosecutor, Ada Jennifer Chen, remained seated, her expression carefully neutral. She had worked with Judge Washington for years and respected his integrity, but even she had to be wondering if he could be impartial today. Judge Washington removed his glasses, a habit when he needed a moment to collect his thoughts. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Counselor," he finally said, addressing Brooks, "I appreciate your concern." However, the incident involving my son is unrelated to this case, and I assure the court I can rule impartially on the matters before me today." Brooks began to protest, but Judge Washington raised his hand. "My personal experiences, like those of everyone in this courtroom, inform my understanding of justice without compromising it. Unless you're suggesting that no judge who has ever had a negative encounter with law enforcement should preside over cases involving officers." The defense attorney hesitated, aware of the trap. To agree would be to suggest that only judges with universally positive views of police should hear such cases, an absurd standard. "No, Your Honor," Brooks conceded. "But then your motion is denied," Judge Washington said firmly. "We will proceed." As the hearing continued, Judge Washington maintained perfect judicial composure, asking pointed questions about chain of custody procedures and warrant execution that revealed his deep knowledge of Fourth Amendment precedents. But inside, a storm was brewing. Every time Officer Calloway spoke, Judge Washington saw his son's bruised face. Every time Officer Simmons shifted in his chair, the judge remembered the hospital report detailing Marcus Jr.'s injuries. Yet he knew that true authority, the kind that created lasting change, required more than emotional reaction. It required strategy, wisdom, and patience. By the end of the hearing, Judge Washington had made a decision. He would neither recuse himself nor exact petty vengeance. Instead, he would do something far more powerful. He would ensure that justice was served exactly as the law intended, with such meticulous attention to procedure that not even the most sympathetic appellate judge could find fault with his rulings. "My ruling on the evidence suppression motion will be delivered tomorrow morning," he announced. "Court is adjourned." As he rose to leave, Judge Washington made brief eye contact with Officer Calloway. The judge's expression revealed nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. True authority didn't need to announce itself. It was demonstrated through actions, not words. And Judge Marcus Washington was just getting started. Evening shadows stretched across Judge Washington's book-lined study as he reviewed case law for tomorrow's ruling. Rain tapped gently against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that contrasted with his inner turmoil. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea in hand. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when a case had followed him home. "You're still working on tomorrow's ruling?" she asked, setting one mug on his desk before settling into the leather armchair opposite him. Marcus nodded, removing his reading glasses. "I can't afford to make any mistakes on this one, Evelyn. Not a single procedural error, nothing that could be interpreted as bias." "Because of Marcus Jr.?" she asked softly. "Because of all the Marcus Juniors," he corrected. "Our son will be fine. He has resources, education, connections. But what about all the young men who look like him without those advantages? Who stands for them when officers like Calloway and Simmons abuse their authority?" Evelyn sipped her tea thoughtfully. As a surgeon, she understood the weight of responsibility, the constant awareness that one's decisions affected lives. "I've spent 20 years believing that working within the system was the best way to improve it," Marcus continued. "That each fair ruling, each mentored law clerk, each community outreach program would gradually bend the arc toward justice. But sometimes I wonder if Marcus Jr. is right, if I've been too patient, too measured." "Is that why you didn't recuse yourself?" Evelyn asked. "To make a point." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't recuse myself because these officers need to understand something fundamental about authority. Real authority isn't about intimidation or force. It's about accountability to the law, to the community, to one's own principles. And you think your ruling tomorrow will teach them that lesson?" "Not alone," Marcus admitted. "But it's a start. And more importantly, it sends a message to everyone watching that justice doesn't bend to intimidation, that the system, flawed as it is, can still work when those within it refuse to compromise their integrity." Evelyn studied her husband's face. She had met him during their undergraduate days at Howard University, when he was a fiery student activist with dreams of changing the world through revolutionary politics. Life had tempered his approach, but never his convictions. "Marcus Jr. called earlier," she said. "He's worried about you, worried this will make you a target." Judge Washington's expression softened at the mention of his son. "Tell him I've been a target since the day I was born black in America. The difference now is that I have the authority to do something about it." He returned to his legal texts, but Evelyn remained, watching him work with the same intensity he brought to everything that mattered. In the morning, he would don his robes and enter that courtroom not just as a judge, but as a father, a black man, and a guardian of justice in a system that too often failed to deliver it. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the city streets clean for another day. The next morning, Judge Washington arrived at the courthouse an hour earlier than usual. The sky was still tinged with pre-dawn purple as he nodded to the security guards and made his way to his chambers. He preferred this quiet time before the building filled with the cacophony of justice being administered, sometimes efficiently, sometimes clumsily, but always noisily. His law clerk, Aisha Johnson, was already waiting, a stack of case files on her desk and dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she had worked late into the night. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, handing him a freshly brewed cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just as he preferred. "I've prepared summaries of all the precedents we discussed, with particular attention to the Hernandez case from the Ninth Circuit." "Thank you, Aisha," he replied, accepting both the coffee and a folder containing her meticulous notes. Aisha was brilliant first in her class at Georgetown Law and destined for greatness. She reminded him of himself 30 years ago, except she was even smarter and more ambitious. "Judge," she said hesitantly, "may I speak freely?" He gestured for her to continue. "The courthouse is buzzing about yesterday's hearing. Everyone knows about what happened to your son. There's speculation about your ruling today." "What kind of speculation?" he asked, though he could guess. "Some people think you'll come down hard on the officers to send a message. Others think you'll bend over backward to appear impartial and let them off easy." She paused. "The court reporters have a betting pool going." Judge Washington sighed. "And what do you think, Aisha?" She straightened her posture. "I think you'll do exactly what you've done for 20 years on the bench, apply the law as written with careful attention to constitutional protections and precedent." He smiled faintly. "And would that disappoint you?" The question caught her off guard. "Sir, would it disappoint you if I didn't use this opportunity to send a message, as they say?" Aisha considered the question carefully. "With respect, Your Honor, you send a message every day you sit on that bench. The question is whether people are listening." Judge Washington nodded appreciatively. This was why he had selected Aisha from dozens of applicants for the clerkship. She understood that the law was not just about rules, but about communication, between the past and present, between competing values, between the ideal of justice and its imperfect implementation. "Well," he said, "let's give them something worth hearing today." At precisely 9:00 a.m., Judge Washington entered courtroom 317 to the usual announcement and ritual standing. Today the gallery was packed not just with the usual lawyers, defendants, and family members, but with journalists, courthouse staff, and even a few off-duty police officers. Word had spread about the potential conflict of interest, and everyone wanted to see how Judge Washington would handle it. Officers Calloway and Simmons sat at the defense table, expressions carefully neutral. Their attorney, Leonard Brooks, shuffled papers nervously. At the prosecution table, Ada Chen looked composed but watchful. "Be seated," Judge Washington instructed. "I have reviewed the motion to suppress evidence in the matter of State versus Henderson, along with all relevant precedents and arguments presented by both sides." He paused, surveying the courtroom. The silence was absolute. "Before I deliver my ruling, I want to address something that many people in this room are thinking about. 3 days ago, my son was wrongfully detained and injured during that detention. The officers involved in that incident are present in this courtroom today." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "I did not recuse myself from this case because the matter before me is unrelated to that incident, and because I took an oath to administer justice without fear or favor. That oath doesn't become optional when justice becomes personal." Judge Washington looked directly at officers Calloway and Simmons. "Some might expect that this experience would prejudice me against law enforcement. Others might think I would bend over backward to prove my impartiality by ruling in the officer's favor despite the evidence. Both expectations misunderstand the nature of judicial authority." He lifted the written ruling from his bench. "True authority is not derived from a badge, a gavel, or a robe. It comes from a commitment to principles greater than oneself, namely, equal justice under law. When any of us officer, judge, or citizen places ourselves above those principles, we forfeit our moral authority, regardless of the power we may temporarily wield." The courtroom remained silent, all eyes fixed on the judge. "My ruling today is based solely on the facts of this case and the applicable law. Having reviewed the evidence, I find that the search of Mr. Henderson's vehicle was conducted without probable cause and in violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. The motion to suppress is granted." Defense Attorney Brooks's shoulders slumped in defeat, while Ada Chen nodded slightly, having anticipated this outcome based on the facts. "Furthermore," Judge Washington continued. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into possible perjury during yesterday's testimony regarding the circumstances of the traffic stop. Officer Calloway's face darkened with anger, while Officer Simmons paled visibly. This court will not tolerate violations of constitutional rights, nor will it accept testimony that contradicts body camera evidence. The integrity of our justice system depends on accountability at every level. Judge Washington set down his papers and leaned forward slightly. Officers Calloway and Simmons approached the bench. The two men glanced at their attorney, who nodded reluctantly. They rose and walked forward, stopping before the raised platform where Judge Washington sat. When he spoke again, his voice was lower but carried throughout the silent courtroom. The authority you were granted when you took your oath as police officers is a sacred trust. It is not a license to operate above the law, but a responsibility to uphold it with the highest standard of integrity. When you violate that trust, whether by excessive force, false testimony, or selective enforcement, you don't just harm individuals like my son or Mr. Henderson. You damage the very foundation of justice you swore to protect. Officer Calloway's jaw tightened. Your Honor, with all due respect, I didn't ask for your response, officer, Judge Washington interrupted, his tone measured but firm. I asked for your presence so you could hear this directly from me. True authority doesn't silence opposition through force or intimidation. It listens, it considers, it follows principles even when doing so is personally difficult. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. You are both young men with long careers ahead of you. I hope that today serves as a turning point, a moment when you recognize that the badge you wear demands more from you, not less. That it requires you to be more accountable, not less. More committed to justice, not less. Judge Washington straightened in his chair. That will be all. You're dismissed. As the officers turned to leave, visibly shaken by the public admonishment, Judge Washington addressed the entire courtroom. Court is adjourned. My written ruling will be filed with the clerk this afternoon. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo longer than usual. As Judge Washington stood to exit, the courtroom remained silent, not the customary silence of respect for the bench, but the deeper silence of collective witnessing. Something significant had just occurred, something that transcended the specific case at hand. Judge Marcus Washington had demonstrated what true authority looked like. News of Judge Washington's ruling spread quickly through the courthouse and beyond. By lunchtime, local legal blogs had published analyses of the decision, praising its meticulous legal reasoning while noting the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it. By dinner, the story had reached national legal circles, where it sparked debates about judicial ethics, police accountability, and the complex intersections of personal experience and professional responsibility. Judge Washington ignored the buzz. After completing his afternoon docket, he retreated to his chambers to work on opinions for other pending cases. This was his pattern to keep moving forward, to focus on the work rather than the reaction to it. A knock on his door interrupted his concentration. It was Chief Judge Alina Michaels, the administrative head of the county court system and his longtime colleague. Marcus, she said, entering without waiting for an invitation. I just finished reading your ruling in the Henderson case. Exemplary legal analysis, as always. Thank you, Alina, he replied, setting aside his pen, but I suspect that's not why you're here. She smiled thinly and took a seat across from his desk. At 68, Alina Michaels had been on the bench longer than almost anyone else in the county. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her political savvy. The Police Benevolent Association is crying foul, she said without preamble. They're suggesting your ruling was motivated by personal vendetta rather than legal merit. They're welcome to appeal, Judge Washington responded calmly. They will, but that's not their only move. She leaned forward. They're filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Committee, alleging bias and failure to recuse. Judge Washington had anticipated this. The facts and the law support my ruling. My written opinion cites 17 precedents and addresses every argument raised by the defense. I know that, Marcus, and any judge who reviews it will see the same, she sighed. But this isn't just about the law, it's about politics. The PBA has influence with the governor who appoints members to the JCC. They're also planning a press conference tomorrow to publicly question your impartiality. Let them, he said simply. My record speaks for itself. Chief Judge Michaels studied him for a moment. You know, when I recommended you for the bench 20 years ago, some people questioned whether you'd be too much of an activist. I told them they had it backward, that your deep respect for the law would make you one of our most principled jurists. She smiled. I was right. Judge Washington appreciated the vote of confidence, but he knew Alina well enough to recognize there was more coming. But, he prompted, but principles come with a price, Marcus. The PBA doesn't forget and they don't forgive. They'll make trouble for you when you come up for reappointment next year. Judge Washington nodded. Judges in their state served 7-year terms, after which they needed to be reappointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate. The process was usually routine for judges with good records, but it could become political. I've never made decisions based on my next appointment, Alina. I don't intend to start now. I know. She rose to leave. That's why I've already spoken to 3 members of the JCC and the governor's chief counsel. I reminded them of your 92% affirmation rate on appeal and the fact that you've never had a single ethics complaint sustained in 2 decades on the bench. Judge Washington looked up at her, surprised by her proactive defense. Don't look so shocked, Marcus. Some of us old warhorses still know how to play the game. She headed for the door but paused before leaving. What you did today mattered. Not just for that specific case, but for what it represents. You reminded everyone that true judicial authority comes from fidelity to principles, not political expediency. After she left, Judge Washington sat in silence for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called home. Evelyn, I'll be a bit late tonight. There's something I need to do first. The community center in Glenwood was buzzing with activity when Judge Washington arrived at 7:00 p.m. For 15 years, he had volunteered here twice monthly, running a legal education program for neighborhood youth. Tonight was supposed to be his night off, but he had called the center director and asked to speak to the evening group. He parked his sedan, not the luxury car many expected of a judge, but a practical mid-range model, and walked into the converted warehouse that served as a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had seen more than its share of hardship. Inside, about 30 teenagers were gathered in a circle of folding chairs. Most were black or Latino, some wore school sports jerseys, others the uniform of street fashion. All looked up with surprise when Judge Washington entered in his suit and tie. Judge, exclaimed Deshawn, a 17-year-old who had been coming to these sessions since he was 13. We thought Mr. Rodriguez was leading tonight. Change of plans, Judge Washington said, removing his suit jacket and loosening his tie. I wanted to talk with you all about something important. The center director, Maria Suarez, gave him a questioning look, but he nodded reassuringly. She stepped back, allowing him to take the floor. How many of you have heard about what happened in my courtroom today? He asked. About half the hands went up. News traveled fast in Glenwood. Then you know I ruled against 2 police officers in an evidence suppression case, the same officers who wrongfully arrested and injured my son 3 days ago. Now he had everyone's attention. These young people lived with the reality of complicated police interactions daily. Many had their own stories of mistaken identity, excessive force, or disrespect. I could have recused myself, stepped aside because of potential bias. Some people think I should have. Judge Washington moved to the center of the circle. But I want to tell you why I didn't and what it means for each of you. For the next hour, Judge Washington spoke candidly about the case, the law, and the deeper principles at stake. He explained Fourth Amendment protections in plain language, describing how they applied to traffic stops and street encounters. He outlined the legal concept of probable cause and what officers could and couldn't do legally. Knowledge is power, he told them. Understanding your rights doesn't guarantee they'll always be respected, but it's the first step toward asserting them effectively. Then he shifted to the bigger picture. Today in that courtroom, I demonstrated something that goes beyond any single case. I showed that true authority, the kind that deserves respect, comes from integrity, not intimidation, from consistency of principle, not arbitrary exercise of power. The teenagers listened intently, recognizing the rarity of an authority figure speaking to them as equals. Some of you may end up wearing a badge someday, he continued. Others might wear a lab coat or work clothes or maybe even judicial robes. Whatever position of authority you hold, remember that your real power comes not from your title or your ability to control others, but from your commitment to something larger than yourself. Tamika, a quiet 16-year-old who rarely spoke in group sessions, raised her hand. But Judge, what about when the system itself is biased? How can working within it ever create real change? It was the same question Marcus Jr. had asked him, the question that had haunted him for years. That's the hardest question of all, he acknowledged. Systems resist change by design, but here's what I've learned. Change happens both from within and without. We need protesters in the streets and reformers in the institutions. We need those who challenge the system and those who work to improve it from the inside. He looked around the circle, meeting each young person's gaze. Each of you will have to decide what role you'll play. But whatever you choose, remember that authority without integrity is just oppression wearing a uniform, and integrity without courage is just good intentions without impact. As the session wrapped up, several teenagers approached him individually, sharing their own experiences with law enforcement and asking for advice. Judge Washington listened to each one, offering guidance where he could and simple acknowledgement where he couldn't. The last to approach him was Deshawn, who had recently been accepted to college on a partial scholarship. "Judge," he said hesitantly, "my cousin got arrested last month for something he didn't do. The public defender told him to take a plea deal because fighting it would be too hard." Judge Washington felt the familiar weight of a system that processed cases rather than delivering justice. "What happened?" "He took the deal. Now he has a record, lost his job, and his girlfriend left him." Deshawn looked down. "After hearing what you did today, I keep thinking maybe he should have fought it. But how can regular people fight when all the power is on the other side?" Judge Washington placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's why what happened in my courtroom today matters, Deshawn. Not because one judge made one ruling, but because it reminds everyone that the system can work as designed when people within it stand firm on principle." "But most judges aren't like you," Deshawn pointed out. "More than you might think," Judge Washington replied. "And more could be if communities like this one demanded it, if voters paid attention to judicial elections and appointments, if young people like you decided to become lawyers and judges yourselves." Deshawn nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I will. I've been thinking about law school after college." "The courthouse doors are open to you," Judge Washington told him. "Not just as a defendant or witness, but as a future guardian of justice. Remember that." As he drove home later that evening, Judge Washington reflected on the day's events. He had used his authority to uphold the law and remind two officers of their own responsibilities. But perhaps more importantly, he had shown a group of young people that authority, properly understood and exercised, could be a force for good rather than oppression. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, to fix a system with deep structural flaws. But it was something. A pebble creating ripples that might someday become waves. The following Monday, Judge Washington's chamber's phone rang shortly after he arrived at the courthouse. It was his judicial assistant, Nancy. "Judge, there's an Officer Simmons here asking to speak with you. He doesn't have an appointment." Judge Washington paused, surprised. "Did he say what this is regarding?" "No, sir, just that it's personal and important." He considered for a moment. Meetings between judges and parties to active cases were generally inappropriate. But the Henderson case was effectively closed with his ruling, pending any appeal, and his curiosity was piqued. "Send him in, Nancy, but stay within earshot, please." A minute later, Officer Michael Simmons entered the chambers. He was out of uniform, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, looking younger and less imposing than he had in court. His expression was tense, uncertain. "Officer Simmons," Judge Washington greeted him neutrally, not rising from his desk. "What can I do for you?" Simmons shifted uncomfortably. "First, I want to apologize for coming without an appointment, Your Honor. I know that's not protocol." "Noted, please continue." "I've been thinking about what you said in court last week, about true authority coming from principles, not power." Simmons took a deep breath. "It's been keeping me up at night." Judge Washington remained silent, waiting. "The truth is what happened with your son. That wasn't the first time something like that happened with me and Calloway. We've been partners for 3 years, and I've seen him escalate situations that didn't need escalating. I've seen him plant evidence. I've seen him file false reports." Now Judge Washington leaned forward slightly. "Are you making an official statement, Officer Simmons?" "No, I mean not yet." Simmons ran a hand through his hair. "I'm trying to figure out what to do. If I report him, I'm labeled a rat. No other officer will work with me. My career is over. And if you don't report him, then I'm complicit and I have to live with that." Simmons met the judge's gaze directly for the first time. "Your Honor, I became a cop because my uncle was murdered when I was 10. The detective who solved the case, who brought that killer to justice, he was my hero. I wanted to be like him." Judge Washington nodded. "And now?" "Now I don't recognize the department I joined. There's this unwritten code, protect your own, no matter what. Don't question, don't report. Calloway keeps saying we're at war with the streets, that it's us against them." "And who exactly is them, Officer Simmons?" The young officer looked away. "You know who, people who look like your son, like you." The blunt acknowledgement hung in the air between them. "So why are you here?" Judge Washington finally asked. "Because what you said about authority and integrity, it got to me, made me realize I'm at a crossroads." Simmons squared his shoulders. "I want to know if I come forward about what I've witnessed, will it matter, or will the system just protect its own like always?" Judge Washington considered his answer carefully. This young officer was reaching out, looking for guidance at a crucial moment. The easy answer would be reassurance, promises that doing the right thing would be rewarded. False hope served no one. I can't promise you a specific outcome, Officer Simmons. What I can tell you is this. Systems don't change overnight, but they do change when enough individuals within them refuse to perpetuate their flaws. He stood and walked around his desk, reducing the physical barrier between them. Coming forward would be difficult and costly. I won't minimize that reality. But remaining silent exacts a different kind of cost, one paid in increments of your own integrity. Simmons nodded slowly. I've already lost sleep, started drinking more. My girlfriend says I'm different, harder somehow. That's the weight of compromise, Judge Washington told him. It only gets heavier with time. So you think I should report what I know? I think you already know what you should do, Officer Simmons. That's why you're here. Judge Washington gestured toward his window, which overlooked the city. Out there are thousands of young men like my son. Like you once were, dreaming of becoming that heroic detective. They deserve officers who serve with integrity even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Simmons was quiet for a long moment. There's an internal affairs Lieutenant Sullivan. People say she's straight, can't be bought or intimidated. Maybe I could start there. That sounds like a reasonable approach, Judge Washington agreed. Document everything you can, dates, times, specifics. The more detailed your account, the more difficult it is to dismiss. Officer Simmons straightened his posture, something shifting in his expression. Thank you, Your Honor, for listening and for what you did in court that day. As he turned to leave, Judge Washington called after him. Officer Simmons, the young man paused at the door. Whatever happens next, remember that true authority comes from within. No badge or uniform can grant it, and no department politics can take it away. It's yours as long as you remain true to your principles. After Simmons left, Judge Washington sat quietly, reflecting on the unexpected visit. He had no illusions about the challenges the young officer would face. Whistleblowers rarely found happy endings, especially in institutions as insular as police departments. But change had to start somewhere, with someone willing to risk personal comfort for larger principles. He thought of his son, still recovering from his injuries but already talking about using his experience to advocate for police reform. He thought of the teenagers at the community center, watching carefully to see if the system could ever work for people like them. He thought of Officer Simmons, standing at a moral crossroads that would define not just his career, but his character. Then Judge Washington turned back to the case files on his desk. There was still work to be done, justice to be administered one ruling at a time. It wasn't enough, it never would be enough, but it was necessary. And today, at least, he had reason to hope it mattered. 2 weeks later, Judge Washington sat on the bench in courtroom 317, listening to arguments in a complex civil rights case involving prison conditions. The gallery was full, as it often was for his proceedings these days. His handling of the Henderson case had made him something of a local celebrity, though he did his best to ignore the attention and focus on the work. During a brief recess, his law clerk Aisha slipped him a note. Channel 7 breaking news officer Calloway indicted by grand jury on multiple charges, including evidence tampering and perjury. Officer Simmons cooperating with investigation. Judge Washington maintained his neutral expression, but internally he felt a surge of vindication. The system was slow and imperfect, but occasionally it worked as designed. When court resumed, he noticed Marcus Jr., sitting in the back row of the gallery. His son had been attending his father's proceedings regularly since the Henderson ruling, watching with new eyes as he considered his own future in the legal profession. After the day's session concluded, Judge Washington invited Marcus Jr. back to his chambers. The younger man moved with a slight stiffness, still healing from his encounter with Calloway and Simmons, but his eyes were bright with purpose. "Did you hear about the indictment?" Marcus Jr. asked as soon as the door closed behind them. "I did," Judge Washington replied simply. "And Simmons turning state's evidence?" The judge nodded. "Cooperation agreements are standard in cases like this." Marcus Jr. studied his father. "You knew this was coming, didn't you? That's why you handled the Henderson case the way you did." Judge Washington removed his judicial robe, hanging it carefully on the wooden stand in the corner. "I knew nothing was guaranteed. I only knew that I had to use my authority correctly and let the consequences follow as they may." "Well, it worked," Marcus Jr. said, a note of admiration in his voice. "You found a way to change things from within the system." "One case, one department, one officer willing to break the blue wall of silence," Judge Washington cautioned. "It's progress, but it's not transformation. It's more than most people accomplish," his son insisted. You've been talking about true authority for years at dinner tables at community meetings from the bench. Now people are finally listening. Judge Washington smiled faintly. Perhaps, but the work continues. He sat down across from his son. How are you feeling, physically, I mean? Better. The ribs still hurt sometimes, but I'm healing. Marcus Jr. leaned forward. Dad, I've been thinking about what happens next. For me, I mean. And I always thought I'd go into corporate law after graduation. Good money, prestigious firms, all that. He shook his head. But after everything that's happened, watching you in court, seeing how one person with principle can create change, I'm thinking about public interest law instead. Maybe even becoming a prosecutor someday. Judge Washington raised an eyebrow. A prosecutor, that's an interesting choice for someone who was just on the receiving end of prosecutorial overreach. That's exactly why, Marcus Jr. explained. The system needs good people on all sides, principled judges like you, ethical officers like Simmons is trying to be, and prosecutors who care about justice more than conviction rates. Pride swelled in Judge Washington's chest, though he kept his expression measured. It won't be an easy path. I know. But I keep thinking about what you always say, that true authority comes from integrity, not power. Marcus Jr. straightened in his chair. I want that kind of authority. Judge Washington stood and embraced his son carefully, mindful of his healing ribs. Then you already understand what took me decades to learn. Later that evening, as Judge Washington drove home, he reflected on the day's developments. Officer Calloway would face justice for his actions. Officer Simmons had chosen integrity over the path of least resistance. Marcus Jr. had found new purpose in his legal studies, and throughout the courthouse and community, people were talking about what true authority meant. It wasn't transformation, not yet, but it was a beginning, and in the slow work of justice, beginnings mattered. As he pulled into his driveway, Judge Washington noticed a small group of people gathered near his front door. For a moment he tensed, wondering if the Police Benevolent Association had sent protesters to intimidate him. But as he approached, he recognized them, teenagers from the Glenwood Community Center, led by Deshawn and Tamika. Judge Washington, Deshawn called out. We heard about the indictment. We wanted to thank you. I didn't indict Officer Calloway, Judge Washington pointed out. A grand jury did. But you started it, Tamika said. You showed us that the system can work when people inside it have courage. The other teenagers nodded in agreement, looking at him with a mixture of respect and hope that humbled him. What happens next? One of them asked. Judge Washington looked at these young faces, the future of his community, his profession, his country, and considered his answer carefully. What happens next, he said finally, is up to all of us. Justice isn't an outcome, it's a process. A commitment renewed each day by those who believe in something larger than themselves. He gestured toward his modest home. Come inside. Let's talk about what true authority means in your lives and how you can claim it, not through power over others, but through integrity within yourselves. As they followed him into the house, Judge Washington felt a sense of cautious optimism. The path of justice was long and winding, with obstacles at every turn. But tonight, at least, it seemed a little more illuminated than before. And in a system that too often operated in shadows, illumination was the first step toward transformation. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Judge Marcus Washington stood before a packed auditorium at the State Judicial College. He had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual Conference on Judicial Ethics, an honor that recognized both his 20 years of service and his recent prominence following the Henderson case. The audience included judges from across the state, law professors, attorneys, and most notably, a new class of judicial appointees preparing to take the bench for the first time. Among them sat Marcus Washington, Jr., newly graduated from law school and recently hired as an assistant district attorney in a neighboring county. As Judge Washington approached the podium, he carried no written notes. After months of reflection on the events that had unfolded from that pivotal day in courtroom 317, he knew exactly what he needed to say. Distinguished colleagues, honored guests, future guardians of justice, he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. I've been asked to speak today about judicial ethics in a changing world, but what I really want to discuss is authority, what it is, where it comes from, and how easily it can be lost. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. 6 months ago, I faced a decision that many of you have encountered or will encounter, whether to recuse myself from a case involving parties who had wronged me personally. The easy path was recusal, step aside, avoid controversy, protect my reputation and career. Judge Washington stepped away from the podium, preferring to address the audience directly. I chose a different path, not because it was easier, but because it was necessary. Not to exact vengeance, which would have been a corruption of my authority, but to demonstrate that true judicial authority derives not from our robes or gavels, but from our unwavering commitment to principles larger than ourselves. He described the aftermath of his decision, Officer Calloway's indictment and eventual guilty plea to multiple charges of misconduct, Officer Simmons's difficult but courageous choice to cooperate with investigators, the departmental reforms initiated by a new police chief, and the community conversations sparked about the meaning of justice. But the most important consequence, he continued, wasn't institutional. It was personal, the individual reckonings that occurred in living rooms and classrooms, in squad cars and chambers, as people throughout our community reflected on their own relationship with authority. Judge Washington moved toward the section where the new judicial appointees sat. To those of you about to assume the bench, I offer this hard-earned wisdom. Your authority will be tested not when it's easy to do right, but when it's difficult. Not when justice aligns with your personal interests, but when it demands their sacrifice. Not when the path forward is clear, but when it requires you to navigate through fog, guided only by your internal compass. He made eye contact with his son, whose proud smile reflected back at him. True authority silences not through intimidation or force, but through the quiet power of integrity consistently demonstrated. It doesn't demand respect. It commands it through actions aligned with principles. Judge Washington returned to the podium for his conclusion. The justice system we serve is imperfect, created by flawed humans, administered by flawed humans, constantly evolving as our understanding of justice evolves. Our role is not to pretend these imperfections don't exist, but to work tirelessly to minimize their impact while maximizing the system's capacity for fairness. He looked out at the audience one final time. In the end, the authority you wield as judges is not truly yours. It is borrowed from the Constitution, from precedent, from the collective wisdom of generations of jurists who came before you. Your task is not to bend that authority to your will, but to be worthy of temporarily wielding it. As Judge Washington stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to acknowledge not just his words, but the example he had set, an example that would guide judicial conduct long after the specifics of the Henderson case faded from memory. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled during the reception, Judge Washington found himself approached by a familiar face, Officer Michael Simmons, now working in the department's Community Outreach Division following his testimony against Calloway. "Your Honor," Simmons greeted him, extending his hand. "That was quite a speech." Judge Washington shook his hand firmly. "Officer Simmons, I'm surprised to see you here. I'm part of a new joint initiative between the department and the DA's office, a working group on improving police-community relations. Your son is our liaison with the prosecutors." Judge Washington nodded approvingly. "How are you finding it?" "Challenging," Simmons admitted. "Some officers still won't speak to me. Others think I'm some kind of reformer hero, which isn't accurate either. I'm just trying to do the job right." "That's all any of us can do," Judge Washington said. "One day at a time, one decision at a time." "I wanted you to know something," Simmons said, lowering his voice slightly. "When you spoke to me in your chambers that day about true authority coming from within, it changed everything for me, made me realize I had been giving my authority away by staying silent." Judge Washington nodded, understanding exactly what the young officer meant. "We're making progress," Simmons continued. "Slowly, but it's happening. New use of force policies, better training. Body cameras that can't be turned off, community review boards with actual teeth. And the culture?" Judge Washington asked. "That's always the hardest part to change." "Still a long way to go," Simmons acknowledged. "But there are more officers asking questions now, challenging the old ways of thinking. Your case, what people around the department call the judge's son case, it woke something up." Before Judge Washington could respond, Marcus Jr. joined them, his new assistant district attorney's badge gleaming on his lapel. "Officer Simmons was just telling me about the reforms underway at the department," Judge Washington explained. Marcus Jr. nodded. "We're seeing the effects in the DA's office, too. More scrutiny of officer testimony, more willingness to drop charges when the evidence is questionable." He smiled slightly. "Some of the old guard aren't happy about it." "Change is rarely comfortable," Judge Washington observed, "but necessary discomfort is preferable to comfortable injustice." As they continued their conversation, Judge Washington noticed others watching them, judges, attorneys, officers observing this unlikely trio with interest. A black judge who had held officers accountable, a white officer who had broken the blue wall of silence, a young black prosecutor committed to reform from within. Three individuals who had chosen the harder path of principled action over the easier path of silent acceptance. It wasn't a resolution, the work of justice never truly ended. But it was a moment worth recognizing, a small victory in the longer struggle for a system worthy of its ideals. Later, as Judge Washington drove home with his son, Marcus Jr., broke a comfortable silence. "You know what I realized today, Dad, watching you give that speech?" "What's that?" "That authority isn't something you're given, it's something you earn every day through your actions." Marcus Jr. looked out at the city passing by their windows. "And that's true whether you're wearing judicial robes or a police uniform or a prosecutor's badge." Judge Washington smiled, hearing his own lessons echoed back to him in his son's voice. "That's right, and once you understand that no one can ever take your true authority away from you. Because it comes from within," Marcus Jr. finished. As they continued their drive, Judge Washington reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from that tense day in courtroom 317 to this moment of shared understanding. It had begun with a wrongful arrest and a difficult decision. It had continued through public controversy and private courage. And it had led to this, not a perfect system but a more conscious one, not complete justice but progress toward it. In the end, perhaps that was the most any of them could hope to achieve, not transformation in a single sweeping moment, but persistent movement in the right direction. Small ripples becoming waves. Individual choices creating collective change. True authority demonstrated not through command, but through example. And in a world where power was too often confused with authority, that distinction made all the difference. 1 year to the day after Judge Washington's ruling in the Henderson case, a ceremony took place on the courthouse steps. The occasion was the unveiling of a new public art installation commissioned by the county, a large bronze scale of justice with an inscription on its base. "True authority comes not from power, but from principle." The phrase, taken from Judge Washington's ruling, had become something of a mantra in legal and law enforcement circles throughout the state. It appeared in law school ethics courses, police academy training materials, and judicial education programs. Now it would stand permanently outside the courthouse, reminding all who entered of the foundation upon which justice must be built. The crowd gathered for the unveiling was diverse judges in formal attire, officers in uniform, community activists in casual clothes, ordinary citizens of all ages and backgrounds. They represented the many stakeholders in a justice system that belonged to everyone yet often seemed distant from those it served. Judge Marcus Washington stood on the platform beside the covered installation, surveying the audience. He spotted his wife Evelyn near the front, camera ready to capture the moment. Beside her stood Marcus Jr., who had recently prosecuted his first major case against a wealthy real estate developer accused of housing discrimination in Glenwood. Near them was Officer Simmons, now a sergeant and head of the department's newly expanded integrity unit. Also present were faces that brought Judge Washington particular satisfaction. Deshawn, now in his first year of college and already talking about law school. Tamika, who had started a youth civic engagement program at the community center. And a dozen other young people from Glenwood who had been inspired to pursue careers in law, social work, and public service. As the mayor concluded her introduction and gestured for Judge Washington to speak, he approached the microphone with characteristic dignity. The crowd fell silent, many recording the moment on their phones. 1 year ago, he began, a routine ruling in a single courtroom sparked something unexpected, a conversation about the nature of authority that extended far beyond legal circles into our broader community. He gestured toward the covered installation. This monument is not a celebration of any individual, but of a principle that must guide all who serve in the pursuit of justice. That true authority derives not from the power to control others, but from the integrity with which we conduct ourselves. Judge Washington looked out at the diverse faces before him. A judge's gavel, an officer's badge, a prosecutor's discretion, these are powerful tools, but they are merely symbols of authority, not its source. Real authority must be earned anew each day through actions aligned with the highest principles of justice, fairness, and respect for human dignity. He turned toward the young people from Glenwood. To the next generation, who will someday stand where I stand and make decisions that affect countless lives, remember that authority exercised without integrity is mere oppression. Remember that power without principle corrupts both the powerful and the systems they serve. And remember that your most important judgments will not be rendered from a bench or behind a badge, but in quiet moments when no one is watching, when only your conscience guides your actions. Judge Washington moved toward the installation. This bronze will weather with time. These words may fade, but the principle they represent must remain eternal if justice is to be more than an aspiration, if it is to be a living reality in the lives of all people, regardless of race, wealth, or circumstance. With that, he pulled the cord, revealing the gleaming scale of justice and the inscription at its base. Applause rose from the crowd, cameras flashed, and reporters rushed forward for statements. As the formal ceremony concluded and people mingled on the courthouse plaza, Judge Washington found himself approached by an elderly man he didn't recognize, thin, white-haired, leaning on a cane. "Judge Washington," the man said, his voice wavering slightly. "I doubt you remember me." The judge studied the lined face, searching his memory. 30 years ago, you were a public defender," the man continued. "I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. The evidence was thin, but I had priors and the prosecutor was pushing for maximum time." Recognition dawned. "Mr. Garner," Judge Washington said, remembering the case. "Armed robbery charge, 1994. The old man nodded, surprised to be remembered. "You were the only one who believed me. You fought like hell, got the case dismissed when the witness testimony fell apart." "I was just doing my job, Mr. Garner." "No," the old man shook his head firmly. "Most lawyers would have pushed me to take a plea. You didn't. You saw me as a person, not just another case file." He gestured toward the new monument. "What that says about authority and principle, you were living that 30 years ago before you had any power or position." Judge Washington was moved by the unexpected connection to his earlier career. "What happened to you after the case, Mr. Garner?" "Got clean, started a small landscaping business, raised 3 kids who never saw the inside of a jail cell." The old man straightened proudly. "My grandson just finished his first year at community college, studying criminal justice, if you can believe it." Before Judge Washington could respond, a young man in his early 20s approached and stood respectfully beside Mr. Garner. "This is him," the older man said. "This is my grandson, Calvin." Calvin extended his hand. "Honored to meet you, Judge Washington. My granddad's told me about you my whole life. You're the reason I want to go into law." As Judge Washington shook the young man's hand, he felt the full weight of legacy, not just his own, but the interconnected legacies created whenever authority was exercised with integrity. From public defender to judge, from father to son, from one generation to the next, the ripples continued outward, touching lives in ways that could never be fully known or measured. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the day's formal events concluded, Judge Washington remained on the courthouse steps alone, contemplating the new monument and its meaning. The bronze scale gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its surfaces reflecting both the building behind it and the community before it, a fitting metaphor for justice itself, which existed at the intersection of institutions and the people they served. The inscription caught the light. "True authority comes not from power, but from principle." Simple words that had emerged from a complex moment. A reminder that would outlast any single case, any individual career, perhaps even the building itself. A standard to which all who wielded authority, judicial or otherwise, could and should be held. As Judge Marcus Washington descended the courthouse steps for the final time that day, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done more than merely administer justice according to law. He had helped to illuminate the moral foundation upon which all justice must stand if it is to deserve its name. And in a world where power was too often mistaken for authority, that illumination might be his most enduring legacy.